They told me in Del Rio not to go near the Hardwick place, said it had been empty since the old man died in '73, that the land itself had gone sour, that even the coyotes wouldn't den there anymore. But I was 32 years old and broke, and broken men don't have the luxury of superstition. I'd heard about the door from a drunk Mexican vaquero in a cantina, heard him swear on his mother's grave that there was gold behind it, a fortune that no one could touch because no one could open it. He said Hardwick had been a paranoid son of a bitch, that he'd built something into that door that made it impossible for any living man to breach. At the time, I thought he was just drunk and spinning tales. But desperation makes fools of us all, and by August of 1890, I was desperate enough to believe in anything. The Hardwick Ranch sat 15 miles west of Del Rio, deep in that brutal stretch of Texas where the land turns hostile and the sun beats down like the fist of an angry god. I rode out on a borrowed horse, carrying nothing but a canteen, a pistol, and the kind of hope that only comes from having nothing left to lose. The property appeared on the horizon like a broken promise, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main house that stood 3 stories tall, its windows dark and watching. The wood had gone gray from years of sun and wind, and the whole place had that particular quality of abandonment that goes beyond emptiness, that speaks of something wrong in the bones of a place. I approached slowly, noting the way the dust seemed thicker here, the way the heat shimmer made the buildings look like they were breathing. There were no tracks in the yard, no signs that anyone had been here in years. The front porch sagged under its own weight, and when I tied my horse to what remained of a hitching post, the animal nickered nervously, ears flat against its skull. I should have paid attention to that. Animals know things we've forgotten how to sense. The door everyone talked about wasn't in the main house. It was in the cellar beneath a separate structure, a low building that might have once been a storehouse or a summer kitchen. I found the entrance after an hour of searching, hidden beneath a collapsed section of roof and years of accumulated debris. The cellar doors were wooden and rotten, and they fell apart when I touched them, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. I lit a lantern I'd found in the barn and went down. The air below was cool and dry, filled with that particular smell of old places, dust and stone and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that made my stomach turn. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, with walls of rough-cut limestone and a dirt floor packed hard as concrete. And there, set into the far wall like a wound in the stone, was the door. It was iron, black as sin, and covered in a patina of rust that seemed to pulse in the lantern light. But what stopped me cold wasn't the door itself. It was the mechanism that held it closed. I'd never seen anything like it. Where a normal door might have a lock or a bar, this one had a complex array of iron wheels and gears, all interconnected in ways that made no mechanical sense. And in the center, where a keyhole should be, there was a shallow depression, roughly the size and shape of a human hand. I approached it slowly, my boots stirring up dust that danced in the lamplight. The door was massive, easily 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and it was set so deep into the stone that it looked like it had grown there, like the rock itself had formed around it. I reached out and touched the metal. It was cold, far colder than it should have been in the summer heat, and the moment my fingers made contact, I felt something pulse through the iron, something that wasn't quite vibration and wasn't quite sensation, but something in between. I tried to open it. Of course I tried. I pushed and pulled, threw my weight against it, examined every inch of those gears and wheels looking for some hidden catch or mechanism. Nothing moved. The door stood as solid as the day it was forged, and after an hour of effort, I was sweating and exhausted and no closer to opening it than when I'd started. That's when I noticed the inscription. It was carved into the stone above the door, so worn by time that I'd missed it in the shadows. I held the lantern close and read the words that someone, presumably Hardwick himself, had chiseled there decades ago. What the living cannot open, the dead cannot keep closed. I stood there for a long time, staring at those words, trying to understand what they meant. Was it philosophy? A riddle? A warning? I didn't know, and in my arrogance I told myself it didn't matter. I'd find a way in. I always did. I made camp in the main house that first night, in what had once been a parlor. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had gone gray with dust and time. I built a fire in the hearth and ate jerky and hardtack, and tried not to think about the door, or the inscription, or the feeling I'd had when I touched that cold iron. But as the sun went down and the shadows grew long, I found myself unable to think of anything else. The history of the Hardwick place was easy enough to piece together from what I'd heard in town. James Hardwick had been a cattle baron, one of the men who'd gotten rich in the boom years after the war. He'd built this ranch in '68, brought his wife and 2 daughters out from Louisiana, and proceeded to make enemies of everyone within 50 miles. He was a hard man, people said, the kind who'd hang a rustler from his own porch beam and sleep sound that same night. But he was also strange, given to fits of paranoia and obsession. Toward the end, people said he'd become convinced that everyone was trying to steal from him, that his own hands were plotting against him, that even his family couldn't be trusted. In '73, his wife and daughters left him, took nothing but the clothes on their backs and rode out one morning while he was checking fence lines. He came home to an empty house, and according to the man who found him 3 weeks later, he'd died in that cellar, in front of that door, with his hand pressed against the iron like he was trying to hold it closed from the outside. The doctor said it was his heart, that the heat and the loneliness had done him in. But the Mexican vaquero who'd told me about the place, he'd said something else. He'd said that Hardwick had died with his eyes open and his mouth frozen in a scream, and that his skin had been gray as ash, like something had drained the life right out of him. I spent 3 days at that ranch, 3 days of obsession that consumed me like fever. I tried everything I could think of to open that door. I brought tools from the barn, pried at the gears with crowbars, even fired my pistol at the lock mechanism, hoping to break something loose. Nothing worked. The door absorbed every effort, every impact, like it was swallowing the force and turning it into nothing. And the whole time I kept thinking about that inscription, kept turning those words over in my mind like a prayer or a curse. What the living cannot open, the dead cannot keep closed. On the 4th day, I rode into Del Rio and started asking questions. Most people didn't want to talk about Hardwick or his ranch, but I found an old surveyor in a boarding house who'd known him, who'd actually been inside that cellar before the door was installed. He told me that Hardwick had commissioned it from a blacksmith in San Antonio, a man who did specialty work, safes and vault doors for banks and wealthy men who didn't trust anyone. But when Hardwick had described what he wanted, the blacksmith had refused the job, called it unnatural, called it an abomination. So Hardwick had gone elsewhere, had found someone willing to build what he needed, though the surveyor didn't know who or where. The surveyor described the mechanism to me as much as he understood it, said it wasn't really a lock at all, not in any conventional sense, said the hand-shaped depression in the center was connected to something inside the door, something that read whoever touched it, that measured temperature and pulse and God knows what else. And the thing was designed so that it would only open for someone whose measurements matched exactly with the original calibration, measurements that Hardwick had set himself when the door was installed. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. The surveyor said that Hardwick had calibrated the lock using his own hand, but not while he was alive. He'd done something to himself first, something with ice water and herbs that the surveyor didn't understand, something that had dropped his body temperature and slowed his heart until his pulse was barely there. He'd made himself as close to death as a living man could be, and then he'd set the lock. And he'd told the surveyor, laughing, that the only way anyone would ever open that door now was if they were dead, or close enough to it that it didn't matter. I rode back to the ranch in a daze, the surveyor's words echoing in my head. I understood now, understood what Hardwick had done and why. He'd made a door that couldn't be opened by anyone with a beating heart, a door that required death to breach. It was madness, the kind of paranoid delusion that only makes sense to a mind that's broken itself against its own fear. But it also meant that if the stories were true, if there really was gold behind that door, then it was protected by something more absolute than any lock or combination. It was protected by life itself. That night, I stood in the cellar and stared at the door for hours, lantern light throwing shadows that seemed to move on their own. I thought about Hardwick, about him dying down here with his hand on the iron, and I wondered if he'd been trying to open it or keep it closed. I thought about the inscription, about what the living cannot open and what the dead cannot keep closed. And slowly, like ice forming on water, an understanding began to take shape in my mind. The door wouldn't open for the living, but Hardwick had died here, had died with his hand on this very iron, which meant his body had been here, in this cellar, at least for a little while before someone found him and took him away for burial. And if the door had been calibrated to open for a dead man's touch, for the temperature and stillness of death itself, Then maybe, just maybe, it had opened for him. Maybe that's how he'd died. Maybe he'd opened the door, seen what was inside, and it had killed him where he stood. I spent the 5th day trying to convince myself I was wrong, that I was letting ghost stories and desert heat cook my brain into seeing connections that weren't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't ignore the logic of it. Hardwick had built a door that only death could open. He died in front of that door. And according to every story I'd heard, he died with his hand pressed against the iron, like he'd been holding something back, or like he'd been trying to pull himself through. On the 6th day, I went to the cemetery in Del Rio and found Hardwick's grave. It was a simple marker, gray stone with his name and dates and nothing else. No wife or daughters had claimed him. No one had stood over this plot and said kind words. He died alone and been buried alone, and even now, 17 years later, there were no flowers, no signs that anyone remembered or cared that he'd ever existed. I stood there for a long time, looking at that grave, and I knew what I had to do. It was insane. It was criminal. It was an act of desecration that would damn my soul if there was any truth to the Bible my mother had read to me as a child. But I was 32 years old and broken men do things that whole men never could. I went back to the ranch, gathered a shovel from the barn, and waited for nightfall. Digging up a grave is harder than you'd think, especially alone, especially in the dark with only a lantern for light. The earth had packed down over 17 years, gone hard and stubborn, and every shovelful felt like it was breaking something inside me, some final barrier between who I'd been and who I was becoming. It took me until almost dawn to reach the coffin, and when I did, when I finally cleared enough dirt to see the rotted wood, I had to stop and retch into the hole I'd made, my body rejecting what my mind had decided to do. The coffin fell apart when I touched it, the wood gone soft and crumbling. And there he was, James Hardwick, or what was left of him. The body had mummified in the dry Texas soil, skin gone brown and leathery, pulled tight over bones that gleamed white where they showed through. His clothes had lasted better than his flesh, and I could still see the remnants of a fine suit, though it was stained and rotted. But what stopped me, what made me stand there in the growing light with my heart hammering in my chest, was his right hand. It was perfectly preserved, fingers extended like he'd been reaching for something, and the skin was gray as ash, exactly as the vaquero had described. I stood there for a long time looking at that hand, and I understood that I'd been right. Whatever had killed Hardwick, whatever had drained the life and color from his flesh, it had happened when he touched the door, when death had finally opened what life could not. I won't tell you the details of what I did next, won't describe how I sawed through bone that had gone brittle as old wood, or how the hand came away easier than I'd expected, or how I wrapped it in my coat and carried it back to the ranch like it was something precious. Some things are better left unspoken, some actions better left to imagination. But I will tell you that by the time the sun was fully up, I was standing in that cellar again, Hardwick's severed hand in mine, ready to open the door that no living man could breach. The hand was cold, cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence that death leaves behind. I positioned it carefully in the depression on the door, matched the fingers to the grooves pressed down. For a moment, nothing happened. The cellar was silent except for my breathing, harsh and quick in the still air. Then I felt it, that same pulse I'd felt before, but stronger now, running through the iron like current through a wire. The gears began to move. They turned slowly at first, grinding and squealing from 17 years of disuse, and then faster, the whole mechanism coming to life with a sound like bones breaking, like something that had been sleeping waking up hungry. The wheels spun, the locks disengaged, and with a final shuddering groan, the door swung inward. Darkness poured out. That's the only way I can describe it. Not the absence of light, but darkness as a presence, as a thing that flowed like water and had weight and substance. It washed over me, and the temperature in the cellar dropped so fast that my breath turned to fog. The lantern flame guttered and nearly went out, and in that moment of dimness, I saw what was inside. It wasn't gold. There was no fortune, no treasure. Nothing but a chamber roughly 10 feet square with walls that seemed to absorb the light. And standing in the center of that chamber, or hovering there or existing there in a way that my mind struggled to comprehend, was Hardwick. Not his body, not his ghost, but something else. Something that wore his shape, but was made of that same thick darkness that had poured out when the door opened. It looked at me with eyes that were holes in the world, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from inside my head and from the stones beneath my feet. It said my name. It said, "You opened the door." And then it said, "Now you can't leave." I tried to run. I turned and scrambled for the stairs, but the darkness was faster. It wrapped around me like chains, like the arms of a drowning man, and it pulled me back toward that open door with a strength that was irresistible. I fought. God help me, I fought. But it was like fighting against gravity, against the pull of the earth itself. And as I was dragged across that threshold, as I crossed from the cellar into that chamber of impossible dark, I understood everything. Hardwick had built this door to protect something, but not gold, not treasure. He'd built it to protect the world from what he'd found, or what had found him. And the mechanism, the lock that required death to open, it wasn't paranoia or madness. It was mercy. Because once you were dead enough to open the door, once you'd crossed that line between life and whatever lay beyond, you couldn't bring anything back with you. You couldn't let it out. The door had been calibrated to death because death was the only thing that could keep what was inside contained. But I'd used a dead man's hand while still alive. I'd cheated the mechanism, broken the rules that Hardwick had died to enforce. And now the door was open and couldn't be closed because the living cannot open what only death can breach, and once death has opened it, nothing can seal it again. The darkness took me. I don't know how long I was in that chamber, whether it was hours or days or years. Time doesn't work the same in that place. Space doesn't mean what it should. But eventually, I was outside again, standing in the cellar with the lantern long since burned out and daylight streaming down the stairs. The door was closed, the mechanism reset, Hardwick's hand lying on the ground where I'd dropped it, gray and withered and useless now. I walked up those stairs and out into the Texas sun, and I kept walking. I left my horse, left everything, just walked until I reached Del Rio and then kept going. People tell me I was only in that cellar for a few hours, that I came out raving about darkness and doors and things that shouldn't be. They tell me I'm lucky to be alive, but I know the truth. I know that I opened something that was meant to stay closed, that I broke a seal Hardwick had died to maintain. And I know that the darkness I saw in that chamber, the thing that wore his shape, it's still there, behind that door, waiting, because the inscription was right. What the living cannot open, the dead cannot keep closed. And I've been dead since the moment I crossed that threshold. I just don't have the grace to stop breathing yet.